Hello, and welcome to another potentially violent episode of Zilog and Moto. It all depends on if I can figure out what a certain code is, I suppose. I'm your host Dave, and this is your weekly look at the English language libraries of the Sega Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega CD, and 32X, where every week I pick a game from those four libraries and review it, including not just a look at the game, featuring game footage captured from original hardware, but also a look at the box and manual, and anything else that might have been included with the game, to give a feel for what it was like to get and play the game back in the day. That English language qualifier from the last paragraph is important in this case, because this week's review is for one of the many Master System games that was not released in the United States, due to coming out on Mortal Monday, September 13th, 1993, and of course the Master System was long dead in the United States by that point. I'm actually a little surprised by that last fact because worldwide, or at least multi-region simultaneous releases, were not at all a common thing at the time, just simply due to the logistics involved. I mean, think about it. Nowadays, it makes sense that everyone would be able to play, say, Diablo 4 at the same time because of digital copies of games. Not to mention the fact that it's easier to produce disc-based copies of games with no manuals, and everyone is able to just play the same versions of games and not have to worry about PAL versus NTSC nonsense. But all that just kind of speaks to what kind of phenomenon Mortal Kombat was and how it overtook the consciousness of gamers at the time. With as popular as the arcade game was for Midway, home ports of the game were simply a matter of when, not if, and Acclaim came up with the idea of Mortal Monday to hype things up as much as possible and make it clear that Mortal Kombat was going to be available on multiple consoles and portable devices, with advertisements like this one on the back of comic books, and then of course TV commercials as well. The Genesis, Super Nintendo, Game Gear, Game Boy, and then of course the Master System all got ports of Mortal Kombat, and then even the Sega CD would eventually get its own port of the game, leaving the only notable exception of a major console at the time to be the NES. The official answer from Acclaim as to why the NES didn't get a port of Mortal Kombat is because they didn't feel the NES had a large enough sales in 1993 to make the separate release worth it. And based on prices of NES games from this era these days, that makes sense, as clearly there's just not that many copies of these games out there because they weren't selling back then. And that totally makes sense, but this is a Sega-centric channel, so I'm going to poke the bear a little bit. I think with the millions of NES consoles out there in 1993, and with as popular as Mortal Kombat was, it would have sold tons of copies regardless, if they could have released a viable product. Yeah, I'm saying it, Mortal Kombat on the NES would look and sound like garbage compared to the arcade version, and that's the real reason there was no NES release, whether they cared to admit it or not. But what about this Master System version? I mean, the Master System was still an 8-bit machine, and it certainly is lacking in horsepower compared to the arcade original, not to mention a certain glaring problem. Well, let's take a look and see what Arena was able to come up with, but first, a look at the package. And this is my copy of Mortal Kombat for the Master System, fresh in from the United Kingdom. I was supposed to review this last month, and then I realized that I'd never picked up a copy of it, so it was off to eBay I went. While I was at it, I managed to pick up a RGB modded Master System 2, so I can finally play those weird Codemasters games, and copies of Alien Storm and Putt and Putter to fill a few holes in the library. But today we're talking about Mortal Kombat, and this copy specifically, which I think is in fantastic shape, with the case being fully intact, hang tab and all, and the inner cover looking perfect with no sun bleaching, water damage, or edge wear. As far as this front cover goes, I'm at a bit of a loss for words. This might be the perfect Master System cover art. Now, granted, a lot of that credit has to go to the original Mortal Kombat logo and title font, which is of course iconic. As soon as anyone sees that black dragon, they know what game or game series it is. And you might be thinking, well, it's great and all, but the Genesis uses the same cover art, so what's the big deal? And, well, you're half right. If you live in Europe and you've got the Mega Drive version, you're correct. It's basically the exact same artwork, just with Mega Drive at the top instead of Master System. The Genesis version, on the other hand, has the Genesis red color banding on the side, which I'm sorry, I get what Sega was trying to do with the color banding for their software, but it almost never looks good and is always a waste of space. But in this case, as a result, the graphics have to get shrunk down to fit, so in this case, the Master System version definitely gets the win. One last note when looking at the cover, note the lack of a VRC rating down in the corner. Now, this is totally normal and to be expected on a European release, but considering Mortal Kombat is one of the games that pushed the need of a rating system, it's kind of interesting to see that it simply wasn't an issue at the time in Europe. Flipping over the back, and the rear cover has a similar layout to its 16-bit big brother, and features the exact set of flavor text that hypes up the game, including all 8 languages, but of course has different screenshots. A picture of the arcade cabinet is shown, just in case you somehow lived under a rock at the time and didn't know what Mortal Kombat was, I guess. And then 4 screenshots from the game that honestly make it look pretty damn good, certainly better than I was expecting on the Master System. I think my only worry with those screenshots is that it seems like 3 of them were taken in the same stage, so hopefully they were able to actually include more than 2 stages. The captions are simple, but for Mortal Kombat, do you really need much more besides, "Get over here, finish him, and Goro lives"? Lastly, it does have the status box that you would expect, and mentions that you can use a Sega control stick with the game, and boy, I'm not sure I can think of a game I'd like to play less with the control stick specifically than Mortal Kombat. That just sounds like a frustrating experience, and anyone that's used the control stick probably understands what I mean. Opening up the case, and the manual and white label cartridge appear well maintained, like the outside. The manual is your traditional landscape European manual supporting 8 languages, but they had the good sense to split the languages up into sections, and you'll end up with some nice full-page layouts with plenty of screenshots and art from the comic book. There's not a ton of info here, and you're left on your own to figure out any special moves as they're just hinted at, but the basics of the game are explained well, and considering the limitations, I think this is a pretty solid manual. Okay, that's the fantastic looking package. Let's get to the game and see if I can take out Shang Tsung. Spoiler, no, I could not. If you're watching this video, there's a good chance you already know what Mortal Kombat is. Younger people may not have actually played the original title, as it debuted in the arcades 31 years ago as of this review, but with its seemingly evergreen popularity, even if you've never tried this first game in the series, you're at least familiar with some of the later games, or perhaps the movies and other media that have sprung up around it. So if you're in that category, where this original game is simply before your time, I should probably talk about some of the basics. But first, if you'll just excuse me, I need to call the local cemetery and reserve a burial plot for myself, as I think I just aged about 20 years typing that disclaimer. In all seriousness, if you're a fan of the original arcade game, you know a few things about the title. The original arcade version featured 7 selectable characters: Johnny Cage, Kano, Liu Kang, Raiden, Scorpion, Sub-Zero, and Sonya Blade, each with their own stages, and then 2 unselectable bosses in Goro and Shang Tsung. Each of the characters not only had special moves, but also a new concept at the time, fatalities, which don't really serve a purpose other than they look cool and can possibly be used to humiliate your opponent after a loss. The arcade game was known for featuring blood, not just in the fatalities, but just in general during the fights, to illustrate the fact that the characters were actively beating the crap out of each other. And finally, the arcade game was built around a 5-button control scheme where rather than having buttons assigned for punches and kicks, and how hard those punches and kicks were, they're set for whether the punches and kicks were low or high, and then a block button thrown in, requiring the player to hold the button to block, rather than pull away from the opponent on the joystick. So, one of the first questions might be when doing the review is going to be, how many of those things were Arena able to get right when porting the game to the unfortunately much less powerful hardware of the Sega Master System, and the limitations of trying to cram everything into only a 4 megabit cartridge? Well, let's start with the characters. Of those characters listed above, they're all here with the exception of 2. Kano was left out as a playable character, and the hidden character Reptile was pulled as well. Removing Reptile kind of makes sense as he was hidden, but I could see the argument that he should have been left in as he's technically a palette swap with Sub-Zero and Scorpion. Removing Kano, however, probably will annoy some people, but I'm going to be controversial for a minute and say no big loss? At least to me, Kano was the least popular of the original 7 characters, and that's reflected by the fact that Kano, along with Sonya Blade, was left out of Mortal Kombat 2. I guess in this case, 6 out of 7 isn't bad? Let's move on to the more glaring difference between the Master System and the arcade, and that's the difference in controls. As mentioned, the arcade setup is with 2 punch buttons, 2 kick buttons, and a block button. But the Master System only has 2 face buttons, and no options buttons like start, select, or run that other consoles might have. That could be maybe used to toggle button functionality, similar to how the Genesis uses the start button if you're using the 3-button controller when playing Mortal Kombat. So you're probably asking, well, how does that work? Well, what developer Probe ended up doing was condensing the moveset down and just setting button 1 for all punches and button 2 for all kicks. Okay, makes sense. This isn't Street Fighter 2 where we're trying to cram 3 levels of attacks into 1 button. But what about that pesky block button? In other fighting games, block tends to be a direction rather than a button, so my initial thought was for them to go with that type of setup instead. And they did. Sort of. Rather than going to a full transition of holding back, they combined holding back while pressing the punch button to block. And this works, to an extent. Occasionally I'll be holding back to try to make some space between myself and the opponent, and throw a punch attempting to hit them as they come in, but then forgetting that it causes a block instead of a punch. But it's something you get used to relatively quickly, and the more I played, the more it became instinctual to throw up a block when a projectile was coming across the screen. Also, blocking works well when you have to input a block as part of a fatality, and it's no more awkward than any other tap or button press. Ultimately, considering what the developers had to work with, I think Mortal Kombat on the Master System controls pretty well. And it feels like Mortal Kombat, complete with the various timings required to pull off the character's special moves. I spoiled some of this next section with something that I just said, but let's talk about one of the key things that makes Mortal Kombat Mortal Kombat, and that's the violence. Famously, when Mortal Kombat was ported to the 16-bit consoles, the Super Nintendo version was censored quite a bit. The blood splatters where the characters were hit were changed in color to gray, with the explanation being that they were now sweat instead of blood. And while the game still had fatalities, they weren't as gruesome as an arcade veteran would expect. The Genesis version, on the other hand, had no blood to start out with, but instead featured the hidden code Abacab that could be put in during an initial screen that discusses the code of combat for Mortal Kombat, hinting at the hidden feature. The Master System uses this same implementation, with of course a slightly different code, and assuming that you know what to input, you can play with full blood and fatalities. Given the choice, I don't think anyone would choose playing the Master System version over the Super Nintendo version, but it's definitely interesting to see that at least in this aspect, the Master System version is closer to the arcade than a game running on much more powerful hardware. So we've talked about some of the functional differences about the 8-bit version of Mortal Kombat, but what about the most important question? How does it play? Well, I mentioned before that the controls, while definitely simplified, still feel like Mortal Kombat. You still got all the attacks you would expect, like jump kicks and punches, the high jabs, round kicks and sweeps, and then of course the classic uppercut. Then there's all the traditional special moves, like Scorpion's Get Over Here, and Sub-Zero's Ice Attack, not to mention Johnny Cage's Split Leg Nutbuster, and they all feel good to input and act just like you would expect them to. Finally, Mortal Kombat wouldn't be Mortal Kombat without the fatalities, and they're all in as well. I had no issues pulling off some of the easier ones, and I feel like I would have been able to do all of them with some practice. I think the only real issue with how the Master System version plays is that it's a bit slow, just due to the limitations of the console and fewer frames of animation. I did also notice that it seemed to be a bit harder than the Genesis version, which I was able to beat, but then on the Master System version, I was never able to make it through the endurance matches, much less to Goro or Shang Tsung. This is probably just a matter of me personally needing to practice more and get good, but it was something I noticed. Graphically, with this being an 8-bit version of a game running on much more powerful arcade hardware originally, it goes without saying that there was going to be some trade-offs. I mentioned the lack of animations previously, and there's a clear difference in the small details between the characters and the backgrounds. But honestly, for it being an 8-bit release, I think Mortal Kombat looks pretty great. You can tell the same original digital sprite work was used, just downgraded to fit the console. The characters are huge for the Master System, and in a way that I almost wonder how on earth they were able to pull it off. I mean, just compare Mortal Kombat with Pit Fighter from 9 months before, and it's night and day the difference between the two. It's not a perfect implementation, of course, and the game has the classic Master System problem of flicker when there's too much going on the same line. For instance, Raiden's Superman attack. But overall, I'm impressed, and there's simply no way the NES could have had a port that looked anything like this. And yes, I'm aware that there's a NES fan version made of the game that actually looks a lot better than I would expect, but it still doesn't hold a candle to this. Aside from the graphics, one of Mortal Kombat's calling cards is its sound implementation. The sound here is courtesy of Alistair Brimble, a wonder kid who was only 22 years old at the time, but who has gone on to have credits on over 200 other games over the years. So even if you aren't familiar with his name, there's a good chance that you've heard his work somewhere else, especially if you're into Nintendo's portable devices. With everything that the game got right graphically, it would be easy to assume that Probe and Alistair might not have been able to do much with the sound, just due to various limitations. But I can safely say that this isn't the case, and Alistair did a great job with what he had to work with. The arcade game is known for not only an atmospheric, techno-inspired soundtrack, but also some pretty great sound effects, with bone-crunching crashes and the occasional bit of speech, either something like "Hiya!" or a groan of pain, or Scorpion's famous "Get over here." The Master System sound implementation is definitely a downgrade from the original, but I still think it's pretty damn good. The included music is solid, and I didn't get annoyed with it even after playing the game for about 2 hours, and it sounds a bit reminiscent of the demo scene at the time. And the sound effects are much better than I was expecting, with there being a decent variety of thuds and crashes to go along with the on-screen action. There's no mistaking the audio in the Master System version for any of the 16-bit versions, but considering some of the soundtracks of the era, and even some that I've reviewed here, it could have been far, far worse. All in all, I was pleasantly surprised with Mortal Kombat for the Master System. For what it is, it's a very solid release that appears to have had a lot of care and thought put into how they could get the most out of the hardware, and release a game that people would still want to play. In seeing the pictures on the back of the box, I knew this release had potential, but seeing decent looking pictures on the back of a box, and then having a game that plays and sounds good as well, it's all you can ask for, and Probe should feel proud of what they delivered. As a result, I'm giving Mortal Kombat on the Master System 3 stars. Yes, that's the same score that I gave for the Genesis version, and clearly the Genesis version is the better port, but there's not really a whole lot of games out there that could have gotten more out of the Master System hardware than Mortal Kombat did, and I'm rewarding it for that. And that was Mortal Kombat for the Master System. For the people in the US that don't get the Master System and look at something like Mortal Kombat and say, well, just play the Game Gear version, it's the same thing. Well, no, it's not. While the games are incredibly similar, take a look at a comparison video sometime, and you'll see that the Game Gear version is zoomed in from the Master System version due to its lower resolution. And while that's fine for some games, in a title like Mortal Kombat, you can really benefit from that extra screen real estate, especially for matching up with the original feel of the arcade version. Next time on Zilog and Moto, it's back to the Genesis. 100 episodes ago, I reviewed a game called Zoop, and if you're not familiar with that title, it's because it was a puzzle game that, while it was released on almost everything, it didn't quite catch on with the masses. So I figured I should review another Genesis puzzle game that not only didn't catch on, but is fairly obscure, even though it was developed by Konami of all people, and is actually the first Konami game to be released for the console. Something that I didn't realize until working on the script for that matter. Well, that's it for Zilog and Moto episode 193. If you like what you saw here and would like to see more, please think about liking and subscribing if you are so inclined, as it will help more people see these videos. But most importantly, whatever you like to play, have fun and be excellent to each other. Later.